This is the U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts, Carmen Ortiz, following up on the penalty phase for Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, sentenced to death. Let's listen in.
Many of you who listened to what was happening in the courtroom today really was a day not just for the conclusion of this piece of it, but really for the victims to have a voice. And many of them had submitted victim impact statements, but they also had submitted, made oral statements today. And so I just want to say that today was an incredibly powerful day. The judge formally imposed his sentence of the death penalty for certain counts, as well as then consecutive life sentences on other counts. But critically important was the voices that we heard from the victims who talked about the impact of the crime and what they have been through and what this has meant to them. And from the very beginning, and I just recently came from, we had a meeting with many of the victims, I noted and I said from the very beginning, I have been so touched and so moved and inspired by their strength, their courage, and their resiliency. And also voices of hope. In that courtroom today, I felt proud that not just to be a Bostonian, but also to be an American, because you heard a number of victims say, not only are we Boston strong, but we are America strong. I hope that the presentation of this case, in terms of viewing all of the evidence, has really exhibited again what a fair and impartial jury system we have in this country. And we believe that at the end of the day, the punishment that was rendered by the jury appropriately fitted the crime. A crime of terrorism, a crime that was not religiously motivated, and a crime that was intended to coerce and intimidate our country. But the response has been otherwise. And finally, I just want to conclude by thanking the FBI, my colleague here, Special Agent in Charge, Vince Lisi, as well as the ATF, State Police, Boston PD, all the other law enforcement agencies that we have worked with from the very beginning. They have worked tirelessly, along with my prosecution team, the assistant U.S. attorneys who presented the case in court and have done tremendous work. And we hope that that was really on display for all to see, our system of justice. Thank you, Vince.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. You know, from the moment those bombs detonated on Boylston Street, the victims, survivors, and their families have had to deal with unthinkable pain and overcome countless obstacles. And while there's no one-size-fits-all healing process, I do think that there are certain events that help them move forward from, that horrific day. We all know that there's nothing in the world, nothing at all, that can take away their pain or return things to the way they are or the way they were, including today's sentence. But I hope that today's proceedings can serve as a milestone as they continue in their healing process. And I just want to let everybody know who was impacted by that savage attack that, the FBI family will keep them in our thoughts and prayers. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I don't want to venture a personal opinion on this, but in general, what I was struck more was by what he didn't say. He didn't renounce terrorism. He didn't renounce violent extremism. And he couched his comments in line with Allah and Allah's views, which give it a religious tone. And there was nothing, as you heard Judge O'Toole say in the courtroom, there was nothing about this crime that was Islam associated. And so that's what I was struck by more.
How can you say there was nothing religious motivated in this crime, given all the references to Allah, to Muhammad, to the Quran? It's been made by him and his brothers throughout this entire deal.
That is a skewed view of the religion of Islam. That is not what Islam is all about. And so when individuals utilize that, it is a radicalized view of that ideology. It's a radical ideology which really isn't at the heart of what is truly a peaceful and loving religion.
Is it true that the defense did offer to have him plead guilty and apologize prior to the start of the trial? That's what Judy Clark admitted.
She mentioned that in court, and I don't want to get into discussions that attorneys have behind the scenes, not only in this, but in many criminal cases. What I will say is that that statement, as it was made in court, was not completely accurate, and it was incomplete.
Was the part about the apology inaccurate?
I really don't want to specify what that comment referred to, really.
Carmen,
It wasn't an apology.
Has this case made the case for cameras in federal courtrooms?
In terms of, would it be more appropriate? You know, I wouldn't want to voice my own personal opinions on cameras in the courtroom. I will say that because of our limitations that we don't have cameras in the courtroom, you all do an amazing job of tweeting the process so that someone outside the courtroom feels as if they're inside the courtroom reading, you know, your messaging in terms of the testimony, the evidence that's being presented. Yeah, it would be best to have a public display, but I'm not speaking for the department right now.
Mr. Lee, are we safer today than on April 15th, 2013? Or are we in more danger than ever?
No, we're not in more danger than ever. I think, though, what people do see is the concern that we have with, you know, the threats coming from overseas. I mean, those continue to exist, and we continue to chase those down. So, you know, I would say that the FBI just looks at this as yet another reason why we need to make terrorism our top priority, and we can't let up. We're not going to take our foot off the gas pedal.
Is there an after report about this? Will we know exactly who the bombs were made? Will we have a FBI accounting of how the gunpowder was?
No, I think the only thing that's going to be out there is what was introduced in court as evidence. Anything beyond that, no, I don't see a report forthcoming, because that would get into speculation, and anything that was evidence that was factual was presented in the courtroom.
Mr. Weinreb, given
What's next for Tsarnaev?
Well, what's actually next is their post-trial motions. So those will be considered next. They'll probably file a notice of appeal. There's a certain time frame within which to do it, I believe 14 days after the judge has entered judgment on the sentence. Then after the decisions are made on the motion, the post-trial motions, motion for a new trial, motion to set aside the verdict, or so forth, and I'm sure others, they will then file, it'll enter the appellate process where they will file the brief, and then the government will have an opportunity to respond, and oral arguments will be set, and then the process will go on.
Mr. Weinreb, you know,
Yeah.
President,
Some of the survivors who are outside of the court just now said that they were disappointed that has to happen, that they have to hear from him again and see him again, that he wouldn't just fade away from this point on and become disagreed. Can you talk to the folks who expressed those feelings?
Sure. I think for those folks who are really concerned about the appellate process, I'd like them to understand that the appellate process is very, very different from the trial process, you know, the jury trial system. It's a written process, so it's really the lawyers filing the briefs and the responses to those briefs. There's one real public proceeding, which is an oral argument, and it's between the parties, the government, and the defense, arguing the appellate issues that occurs in the First Circuit, which is here at the federal courthouse. Usually each side is given 15 minutes, 20 minutes. The issues are lengthy or so as the appellate judges decide, the appellate court rules. And then the appellate judges take time to decide the case and write an opinion, and then the opinion issues. So it's a lengthy written process where there really isn't this kind of opportunity for a lot of public and media presence. So it's very different, and I hope that will bring some degree of comfort to them in terms of the process being different.
Mr. Weinreb, your team never got to question Tsarnaev on the stand. What did you make of him when he had to say in court?
Well, like the U.S. Attorney, I was struck more by what he did not say. It's one thing to apologize or to say that you feel bad about the suffering you caused, but he did this for political reasons. This was a politically motivated act. And at no point during his statement did he renounce the reasons for which he committed this act. He never renounced terrorism. He did not repudiate violent extremism. I think that it's important to keep in mind that this is somebody who was being sentenced to death for the acts that he had taken against specific individuals. He addressed his remarks to those individuals, but we didn't hear a word about the reasons for why he did this crime.
Did you ever think he would take the stand?
Take the stand and testify?
Yeah.
That was something that was entirely up to him and in consultation with his counsel. We were ready for him to take it or not, as he saw fit.
Agent Lisa, can you speak to the incident out front with the man with the meat cleaver and what
Sure.
if any connection it might have to what's going on?
Yeah, he's in BPD custody right now. You know, with today's threat environment, as we mentioned earlier, we can't overlook anything. So we've sent some people from our Joint Terrorism Task Force down to BPD, and they will work with them and try to figure out what, if any, terrorism nexus there might be, if at all.
So at this moment it's unclear.
Yeah, right, it's unclear. Like I said, but in an abundance of caution, we sent our JTTF down to BPD, and we will work closely with them as we have in the past.
Mr. Macy, any risk that the Bureau's resources are so focused on Islamic terrorism and not Islamic terrorism, but perhaps expired terrorism like we've seen in the attack, that we lose sight of the more domestic and right-wing terrorism, such as the South Carolina incident last week?
No, there's no concern. I can tell you that whenever we sit down and we look at our threats and prioritize and decide how we're going to allocate the resources, right, the threats from the domestic side receive just as much attention. So we're not going to divert any resources away from that.
Where is Tsarnaev physically now going to be held now that the sentence is over? Does he immediately go to a different location, or where is he?
Do you go? Yeah, go ahead.
He will be held in custody and handed over to the Bureau of Prisons, who will take him to an institution where he'll begin serving his sentence, and that will begin right away.
So is he going to Indiana now?
It's up to the Bureau of Prisons where he goes. Eventually, he will go to the institution in Terre Haute. Whether he goes there immediately or whether he goes there after a period of time is up to the Bureau of Prisons, and that's a decision that they make according to their own criteria.
What would be the alternative for now? Where would he be until he goes to Terre Haute?
If he doesn't go to Terre Haute immediately, he may go to ADX in Florence for a period of time, as was discussed at the trial.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And there you're hearing from the prosecutor, Carmen Ortiz, along with a bevy of other officials after the sentencing of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, today to death, the judge following up on what the jury had to say. We heard from the prosecutor, again, somewhat jolted, it seemed, by the specter of religion in Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's statements, and somewhat disappointed and chagrined at the fact that he did not denounce violence and the kind of terror that he caused on April 15th, 2013. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, surprising a lot of people, did give a statement today where he apologized to his victims, to their families, and to the survivors. He said immediately after the bombing, which I am guilty of, if there's any lingering doubt about that, let there be no more. I did it along with my brother. He said he learned about some of the victims. You're seeing there on your screen the court artist rendering of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev today, as you can see, wearing a suit jacket with a full beard. And we've been told that in many parts of the testimony from the victims, he was looking down, not looking at the victims, and fiddling with his beard somewhat. In his statement, he said that in this trial, he learned their names, their faces, learned their ages. Throughout the trial, more of those victims were given names. I was listening, he says, to the suffering that was and the hardship that still is. What strength, what patience, and what dignity. He said that he learned how unbearable it was, how horrendous it was, quote, this thing that I put you through. And he said that he's sorry. But then he went on to say, I ask Allah to have mercy upon me, my brother, and my family. He says, I am a Muslim. My religion is Islam. The God I worship is one, and there is no other God than Allah. And again, that seems to be part of the statement that the prosecutor in this case took umbrage with, as did victim Lynn Julian, who's a survivor of the bombing as well. She came out and was furious. She thought that the apology was insincere, and she said that before the bombing, she thought she was living in a false bubble of security, but that the Tsarnaev brothers and their bombs had taken that away from her. On the other hand, we've heard on the other end of the spectrum from many victims' families that there is forgiveness in their hearts and a hope for peace and hoping that they can come to some kind of terms with what the Tsarnaev brothers had done. Again, hearing today Tsarnaev apologizing to his victims. Now, as you heard in that news conference, that he will be handed over to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. There is an automatic appeal that happens at this point, and that's just part of the process. But what happens after that, how long the appeals process takes before an execution might take place, is really up in the air at this point and may depend somewhat upon Dzhokhar Tsarnaev himself and how long he wants to fight the death penalty, the execution. He has owned up to his part in this, his responsibility for the bombing. We wait and see what happens.